the early days of rocket technology were littered with spectacular failures. Cold War adversaries, the Soviet Union and the United States, were in a rush to acquire missile technology to deliver the newly developed hydrogen bomb. During the Second World War, Germany had been working on ballistic rockets. Many of their early attempts had also been unsuccessful. By October 1942, the German team, led by Wernher von Braun, had a workable prototype. When the weapons went into mass production, V-2 attacks were launched against Britain and Belgium. With the fall of Berlin, Russia and America were keen to get their hands on V-2 technology, and German technicians captured at the end of the war were vital to the early rocket programs of both sides. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union began work with clustered engines, and the R-7, the forerunner of today's Soyuz, emerged. The new R-7 featured 2 central stages flanked by 4 boosters, a configuration that's still used today. It could deliver a heavy thermonuclear warhead to a target in North America. And the R-7 was powerful enough to put a satellite into orbit. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched an 83-kilogram satellite called Sputnik, and everything changed. As it orbited, Sputnik transmitted a beep that could be picked up by radio as it passed overhead. America took this as a direct challenge. The US had 2 candidates close to launching a satellite: an Army team with its Jupiter C missile, headed by German V-2 engineer Wernher von Braun, and a naval team called Vanguard. Compared to the Army's Jupiter 1, Vanguard was largely unproven. But because the US was reluctant to rely upon von Braun and his German team, Vanguard was given the task of launching America's first satellite. However, the Russians had a new surprise. 1 month before Vanguard's launch date, and barely a month after Sputnik's flight, another R-7 was on the pad. This was the launch of Sputnik 2. And this time there was a passenger, a terrier called Laika. In the US, Cold War paranoia was becoming extreme.
Gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this.
Pressure was building on the Vanguard team to salvage American pride. In addition to the reporters and photographers covering the event, it was announced that the launch from Cape Canaveral would be screened live. It was a national humiliation.
And here, Pickering, Van Allen, von Braun.
Von Braun's team was given the go-ahead. In weeks, the group developed a satellite named Explorer 1 that was a fraction the size of Sputnik. Unlike Sputnik, which just carried a radio transmitter, Explorer 1 contained a scientific payload. The Juno 1 was a modified Redstone rocket with a rotating upper stage, a simple technique devised by von Braun for doing away with a final stage guidance system.
The 4-stage Jupiter C in the tense period before time zero at 10:48 p.m. The last 3 stages are set spinning on takeoff for guidance purposes.
It was simple, but it meant that Juno could not deliver its payload accurately to a circular orbit. But the Americans were in a hurry.
In 1958, free men everywhere lifted their gaze to Freedom's satellite.
Later in 1958, President Eisenhower established a civilian-led space agency which absorbed much of the Army missile unit as well as the Vanguard program. It would be known as NASA. In 1959, NASA selected 7 astronauts for a manned space program, which only existed on paper. Russia also had selected a cosmonaut corps and was working to put the first man into orbit. The research, backed by huge engineering budgets, was becoming a proxy war between the superpowers, and so far the Soviet Union was winning. But NASA had inherited the X-15 program, a rocket-powered aircraft that was delivering valuable data about flight control at the boundaries of the atmosphere. The X-15 glided back to the ground without power, and the techniques gathered here were of benefit to NASA when the space shuttle was in development. One of the X-15's pilots would join NASA in its second intake of astronauts. His name was Neil Armstrong. But the Soviets were forging ahead. After several mishaps, they had returned a pair of dogs, Belka and Strelka, safely from space. And in 1961, they were preparing to put a man in orbit. On the 12th of April 1961, a young Air Force pilot climbed into his Vostok 1 capsule. His name was Yuri Gagarin. The first man in space. The Soviet Union had set the most prestigious record yet. The United States had a spacecraft, the Mercury capsule, but they needed a heavier booster to take it to orbit. Explorer 1 had been lifted by a Redstone derivative, and early unmanned Mercury flights would also use the Redstone. Alan Shepard was due to make America's first manned spaceflight atop a Redstone, but it would be a suborbital flight. The new, more powerful Atlas would take the first astronaut into orbit, and so far, neither launcher was performing reliably. Finally, in May 1961, after a chimpanzee had tested the Mercury-Redstone combination, Alan Shepard would become the first American to fly in space. The flight lasted 15 minutes. Shepard and his Freedom 7 capsule were picked up 480 kilometres off the coast of Florida. Later that month, America's newly elected President Kennedy committed his country to a landing on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The USSR and the USA emerged as post-war superpowers. Ballistic missile technology was pushed centre stage. Early results were frequently catastrophic. Because America could station missiles in Western Europe, they developed short-range weapons. But the Soviet Union had to develop the capability of delivering a heavy nuclear payload from Russia to the United States. The R-7 Semyorka was the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. It also gave the USSR the ability to launch a satellite into orbit, a huge advantage in the early years of spaceflight. Americans were alarmed when their communist enemy began setting space records that were years beyond their free market technology. In 1958, President Eisenhower established NASA to consolidate America's space effort in one civilian agency, and the newly assembled team started work in a hurry. The overwhelming feeling in the US was they were well behind the Russians. NASA absorbed the US Air Force's Man in Space Soonest program. It was renamed Project Mercury. Engineers began work on a titanium space capsule that could sustain a human in the vacuum of space and withstand the searing heat of re-entry. As prospective astronauts, 110 military test pilots met NASA's basic prerequisites and were invited to enter the rigorous selection process devised to choose the Project Mercury team. As well as being a qualified jet pilot with 1,500 flying hours, applicants had to have an engineering background and be younger than 40 at the time of selection. But some pilots were reluctant to volunteer, feeling that astronauts would do little flying, simply serving as glamorized lab rats. When the first 7 astronauts were introduced at a press conference, they were lauded as movie stars. It was 1959, and the only living thing to have orbited the Earth was a Russian dog. It was known that the Soviet Union was working to get a man into space, but NASA was determined that an American would get there first, so they began modifying the proven Redstone booster. Although it did not have the power to launch a man into orbit, they planned to make a series of short suborbital flights to test their technology. NASA's first manned orbital flights would use the SM-65 Atlas missile, a much larger ICBM that was being modified to carry the Mercury capsule. But reliability was a problem. In September 1959, during the static test of an Atlas, a turbo pump failure triggered a complete shutdown. But fire persisted. The damaged pump was leaking oxygen. Damage to the pad took 7 months to repair. Because so many boosters were blowing up, an emergency escape system was developed. A tower atop the capsule housed a small but powerful solid fuel rocket that could pull the spacecraft clear of a catastrophic failure. To test the escape system, a new booster known as Little Joe was built. It was based on existing technology and cheaper than using a full-scale rocket. The escape tower was tested on the ground at maximum dynamic stress and at very high altitude. A complex sequence of events had to happen automatically to return the capsule safely to an ocean splashdown. This would give problems at a later stage of testing. The capsule itself had to be tested, and the new astronauts were each given an area of specialization. Engineers would get direct input from the people who would fly the Mercury spacecraft. At NASA's Langley Research Center, the new astronauts were schooled in concepts such as retrofire and re-entry. The Mercury 7 all had engineering degrees, and even at this stage, their feedback was leading to redesign of capsule control systems. Simulators were developed that gave an astronaut the sensation of a tumbling capsule, allowing the team to gain experience before they flew. On special flights, they had a taste of zero gravity. Towards the end of 1960, the Mercury team was nearing full-scale flight tests. The first Mercury-Redstone combination would make an unmanned suborbital flight to qualify the system. Alan Shepard had been selected to make the first manned flight, and it seemed he would be the first man in space. Known as MR1, this first Project Mercury vehicle was assembled at Cape Canaveral's Launch Complex 5. It would test the automated flight control, the launch and tracking system, as well as recovery procedures. The capsule's automated abort system, a vital safety feature, would also be tested. It would be known as the 4-inch flight. The booster engines abruptly stopped, and the escape tower was jettisoned as programmed at the end of the boost phase. This triggered the deployment of the parachutes, leaving the capsule in place atop the fully fueled Redstone. The problem had been caused when power plugs at the base of the Redstone disengaged in the wrong sequence. A technician had filed down a contact to make it fit. A new booster was flown in to replace the damaged one. The same capsule would be used for the second attempt, but it had to be refurbished. The electrical connections that had triggered the engine shutdown were redesigned, and the automated sequencing for jettisoning the escape tower had been rethought. Main engine cutoff could only trigger the release of the tower 137 seconds after liftoff. The delayed flight, now known as MR-1A, was launched on December the 19th. It flew higher than expected, but was otherwise flawless. Yet NASA had lost a month in their rush to put a man in space first. A chimp would make the next flight. Engineers were uncertain about risking an astronaut when the booster was still flying too high. Chimp number 65, known as Ham, would fly before a human, and the astronauts were not happy. The flight was designated MR2, and if it all went well, Alan Shepard would be next. But things did not go well. An overactive pump depleted the engine's liquid oxygen too quickly, and when the engine pressure dropped, the escape system kicked in, lifting Ham's capsule to an altitude of 253 kilometres, far higher than had been planned. Because the escape system had activated, the capsule's retro rockets had been jettisoned, meaning the spacecraft's ballistic return to Earth could not be slowed. Ham, the astro chimp, experienced more than 14 G during re-entry. Next, a valve opened early and the capsule lost pressure. Finally, when the capsule splashed down, 200 kilometres beyond the planned point, the impact bag was shredded and the heat shield had punched holes in the capsule base, flooding it with seawater. Ham had survived, protected inside the small compartment which functioned as his spacesuit, but debate about whether the system was ready to take an astronaut began. An extra flight to sort out the bugs in the Redstone booster was scheduled. At the same time, NASA was preparing the much larger Atlas booster in readiness for orbital flights. Developed as a weapons delivery missile, the Atlas was also being used to launch satellites. Its very thin stainless steel skin made it very light, but it was also fragile, and its early safety record was not good. At its first launch, carrying a dummy Mercury capsule, the Atlas's thin skin buckled. It would be strengthened for all subsequent flights. It had not been publicly announced that Alan Shepard would make the first Mercury flight, but team members were growing in confidence that he would become the first man in space. But his flight was postponed several times. A replacement for the booster needed for the extra development test was slow in coming. An original launch in February 1961 was put off till March, then to May.
Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой.
In April, the Soviet team had yet another surprise. After a heartfelt farewell, Colonel Yuri Gagarin prepared to enter his Vostok spacecraft. The flight and Gagarin's identity had been a closely guarded secret, with none of his cosmonaut colleagues being aware who was to make the first attempt. The craft would function automatically, with Yuri Gagarin needing to enter a code to unlock the controls should it be necessary. Gagarin completed one full orbit of the Earth and returned safely. He was only in radio contact while flying over Russia. The first cosmonaut was a hero. The first manned spaceflight captured the world's attention, and it surprised the Soviet Union as much as anyone. The smiling Gagarin became a huge asset to his country. The Soviet leaders wanted more, and government funding for space was assured. One group not happy about Gagarin's flight were the Mercury astronauts. While they were getting plenty of publicity, all they had done so far was train. Alan Shepard had missed the opportunity to be first, and his short suborbital flight would be an anticlimax after the Soviet triumph. In the early hours of May the 5th, 1961, Shepard arrived at Cape Canaveral's Launch Complex 5. A Redstone launcher stood waiting, topped with a Mercury capsule Shepard had named Freedom 7. It was a pointed dig at the Soviet Union's political system. American media had branded Gagarin's flight as a propaganda stunt rather than a scientific achievement.
3, 2, 1, 0.
All Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
After a delay, Freedom 7 blasted off. The flight climbed to a height of 187 kilometers.
PSI, oxygen is go. What a beautiful view.
At several points, Shepard took manual control of his craft, but it was over quickly, with the flight lasting just 15 minutes and 22 seconds. Freedom 7 splashed down in the Atlantic off the coast of Florida. Though Shepard had not orbited, Project Mercury had put a man in space, and America was keen to catch up. The idea that there was a race between the superpowers was becoming all too clear.
This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go. 1.2 G. Cabin at 14 PSI.
In May 1961, Alan Shepard had flown a brief suborbital hop in his Freedom 7 space capsule. The Redstone booster that had launched Shepard was not capable of lifting a heavy spacecraft to orbit. The flight caused celebration in America, but by comparison, the first man in space, Russia's Yuri Gagarin, had completed a full Earth orbit and had become an international celebrity. The newly formed American space agency, NASA, had been charged with closing the space technology gap with its communist adversary, the Soviet Union, and Project Mercury was the means for achieving this. Until the more powerful Atlas booster was ready, the only rocket Project Mercury had was the Redstone, and NASA was keen to refine the Mercury capsule, so a second suborbital flight was scheduled. This time, the astronaut would be Gus Grissom.
The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all.
Less than 3 weeks after Shepard's flight, America's president made a decisive contribution.
Adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
At NASA, the training program and the preparation for the second Mercury flight with astronaut Gus Grissom continued as scheduled. But administrators realised that their president's announcement would mean a rapid expansion of the space agency. New staff were hired and long-term contracts were negotiated. Of immediate importance were modifications to the Mercury capsule. At the astronauts' request, a window was added and a new hatch using explosive bolts had been designed for quicker egress. 70 bolts held the hatch in place, but these now had an intentional weak point and a small explosive charge would blow off the hatch if required. Gus Grissom would be the first to fly with the new hatch. It could be triggered from both inside and outside the capsule. On the morning of July the 21st, 1961, another Redstone rocket was being fueled. Since Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in April, nothing had been heard from the Russians, and the Mercury team could feel they might be catching up to their communist adversaries. Weather had already caused this flight to be postponed 3 times. Grissom had named his Mercury capsule Liberty Bell 7. Confusingly, all Mercury spacecraft had the number 7 because there were 7 astronauts. This mission was similar to Alan Shepard's flight, lasting around 15 minutes, with most important events happening automatically. However, the thruster control system had been modified, but Grissom would have less than 3 minutes to test it. The launch tower rolled back after a half-hour delay. One of the hatch bolts was misaligned, and it took engineers some time to conclude that the remaining 69 bolts would be enough.
2, 1, 0. Liftoff.
Roger, this is Liberty Bell 7. The clock is operating.
Loud and clear.
Testing the manual thruster control, Grissom found it more sluggish than the ground-based simulator. On changing to the new rate command control system, he found it worked well, but was heavy on fuel.
I'm going to try this lithiometer. About all I can really see is clouds.
All too quickly, he was preparing for re-entry on what had seemed a perfect flight. Aircraft in the landing area picked up a radio beacon that started when the capsule's parachutes deployed. Helicopters soon found Liberty Bell 7 floating right on target. Everything appeared normal. Inside the capsule, Grissom had released the safety catch on the hatch. Not long after, the explosive charge blew the hatch open and the craft began filling with water. Grissom had to jump clear, and the helicopter was struggling to lift the water-filled capsule clear of the waves. Warning lights in the chopper indicated the engine had been overtaxed and that failure was imminent. The pilot dumped the capsule, which sank beneath 5,000 metres of the Atlantic. Grissom had been struggling to stay afloat too, and he was winched to safety in a water-filled spacesuit. The loss of the capsule and its valuable data was not good, and immediately engineers began asking how the hatch could blow on its own. Grissom was adamant that the hatch had blown by itself. While he was still soaking wet and with doctors trying to examine him, he took a congratulatory call from President Kennedy. Gus Grissom's suborbital flight would be the last Mercury mission to use the underpowered Redstone booster. Project Mercury planners wanted their next astronaut to go into orbit, but there was a problem. The more powerful Atlas booster they were relying on only had a 30% success rate. Designed in 1955, the Atlas was developed as a nuclear weapons delivery system, but by 1961 the technology had not matured. It was not dependable. At this point, NASA had launched 3 unmanned Mercury Atlas combinations, and 2 had failed catastrophically. NASA was beginning to argue with Convair, the rocket's builders, about reliability. Modifications, including a thicker skin and a transistorized telemetry system, were introduced. Soviet Union launched Vostok 2.
Newspaper headlines tell the story. Herman Titov of Russia returns to Earth after orbiting the globe 17 times in a little more than 25 hours, covering 435,000 miles, which is more than twice the distance from the Earth to the Moon. An orbit by a U.S. astronaut is planned later this year.
His name was Enos, and just as chimpanzee Ham had tested the first Mercury Redstone, Enos would test the Mercury Atlas. NASA gave all its really dangerous missions to chimpanzees. In November 1961, Enos blasted off. He orbited twice in 3 hours and 20 minutes and, although it wasn't a flawless mission, it gave the planners confidence that most of the glitches had been eliminated from the Mercury-Atlas combination. The next Mercury mission would carry John Glenn. He would be America's first man to orbit the planet. The flight had been scheduled for January the 16th, 1962. But technical issues and then problems with the weather meant that the launch had been delayed till February the 20th. For the US, this was an important mission. It would show that they were catching up with the Russians, who had clearly demonstrated their capability for long-term orbital flights. People had turned out along the beaches of central Florida to watch the launch, and national pride was on the line. The Cold War had reinforced Stars and Stripes patriotism, and John Glenn, in the spacecraft he had named Friendship 7, was striking a blow for truth, justice, and the American way.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
Everything about the launch was close to flawless.
Okay. A little bumpy along about here.
5.5 minutes after blastoff, Friendship 7 was in orbit, and Mission Control affirmed that the trajectory was good for at least 7 orbits.
Started. Seco.
There was a minor problem with thrusters, but when a faulty sensor indicated that the spacecraft's heat shield had come loose, it was decided to bring the mission to a close after just 3 orbits.
Capsule turning around, and I could see the booster during turnaround just a couple...
3 days after his return, at a ceremony at the Manned Spacecraft Center, the President decorated John Glenn with NASA's Distinguished Service Award, and across the US, support for the manned space program was enthusiastic. There were 3 more manned orbital flights in the Mercury program, each one increasing in duration, refining techniques and technology. Ultimately, the last scheduled Mercury missions were cancelled in favour of the next program. NASA was in a race to the moon, and Project Gemini was a big step in that direction. Gemini was the brief but intense interim program where NASA pioneered rendezvous manoeuvres needed for lunar missions. In 1963, Project Mercury had come as far as the technology would allow. The final 3 missions were cancelled so that NASA could shift focus to a new program and develop the techniques needed to reach the moon. It was decided that before embarking on the 3-man Apollo program, as had been intended, an intermediate stage to learn about orbital rendezvous and docking was needed.
It was in Houston that Mr. Kennedy emphasized the need for peaceful uses.
It was called Project Gemini, and in many ways, the new program's capsule was more advanced than the Apollo spacecraft that would follow it. It was designed for a two-man crew, and astronauts referred to it as the Gusmobile because Mercury veteran Gus Grissom had played a major role in its development. The Gemini spacecraft would have the ability to change its orbit, and it included instrumentation and systems that were borrowed from jet fighters. One of its most revolutionary features was its onboard computer. It had a memory of just 20 kilobytes. At the beginning, it was proposed that the Gemini capsule wouldn't have landing parachutes, but a Rogallo wing. Grissom was involved in the early tests before this idea was abandoned. It added a layer of complexity that couldn't be easily accommodated in the capsule's design, and NASA reverted to the traditional water landing. To boost the Gemini spacecraft to orbit, NASA hastily adapted the US Air Force's Titan II missile. The Titan II had a much simpler design because it used hypergolic propellant which could remain stored in the rocket for long periods. The two fuel components didn't have to be kept at sub-zero temperatures, but they were extremely toxic and dangerous to handle. Designers understood that any launch mishap wouldn't cause the large explosions seen with liquid oxygen, so they dispensed with the launch escape system used in the Mercury program and equipped the Gemini capsule with ejector seats. Of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, only Grissom, Schirra and Cooper remained, with the rest having left NASA or having been suspended for medical reasons. To bolster its core of space pilots, NASA took in a second group of 9 astronauts in 1962 and another 14 the following year. Before the astronauts could fly, the Gemini-Titan combination had to be tested to demonstrate its reliability. The booster was prone to rapid variations in thrust, known as pogo oscillations. Modifications were made to the rocket, and unmanned flights of Gemini 1 and 2 were made in 1964 and 1965. Mercury veteran Gus Grissom and new recruit John Young would fly the first manned Gemini mission. Because the Gemini craft was fitted with ejector seats, they had special training exercises that involved parachuting into the water. The two astronauts also spent long hours in the Gemini simulator, where engineers could run them through challenging scenarios that may happen in space, while also training mission controllers. The Gemini 3 flight was scheduled for March the 23rd, 1965, and as the launch date approached, publicity became intense. The new President Lyndon Johnson was keen to be seen with the next astronauts. America was gaining confidence about its future in space. 5 days before Gemini 3 was due to blast off, the Soviet Union launched a two-man spacecraft. What nobody was expecting was another record, the world's first spacewalk. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov left his Vostok 2 capsule to float freely in space for 12 minutes. In the West, it was perceived as another Soviet triumph. In reality, Leonov's suit had distorted, and he was only just able to get back inside. The whole mission was plagued with difficulties, but these details didn't come to light for decades. For America, Gemini 3 felt like a welcome return to space. It had been almost 2 years since a NASA astronaut had been in orbit.
You're on your way, Molly Brown.
It would be the first of 10 manned Gemini missions. American media was making the astronauts household names. A achievements of the new manoeuvrable craft in space included the first change in orbital shape and the first change in orbital plane. After just 3 orbits, Grissom and Young returned to Earth. During the Mercury program, astronauts had named their capsules. Grissom had named Gemini 3 Molly Brown, after the Broadway show The Unsinkable Molly Brown. NASA did not like this, as it was a reference to Grissom's Mercury capsule that had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Barely 3 days after their return to Earth, Grissom and Young were at the White House, where President Johnson presented them with NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. Then, something that was to become common across the Gemini missions: a ticker tape parade through the streets of New York. NASA understood that the American public needed something in return for the hugely expensive space program. It gave them a new brand of hero. The next mission, Gemini 4, would be a much longer duration flight. Its crew would be from NASA's second intake of astronauts, Ed White and Jim McDivitt. They had been in training for 3 years. White had been practicing with a special manoeuvring unit that he would use during NASA's first spacewalk.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Gemini 4 blasted off on the 3rd of June 1965. After the previous flight had verified the spacecraft, this mission would work out how to use it. Soon after reaching orbit, the crew located the rocket's discarded second stage and tried to move towards it using visual cues only. But the more McDivitt manoeuvred towards it, the further away the booster got. Rendezvous was going to be harder than it seemed, and Mission Control called the exercise off. There was a more important task. During the 3rd orbit, Ed White opened the door of the depressurized capsule and, using the manoeuvring unit nicknamed the Zip Gun, he moved into the void. This exercise had been shifted up the Gemini schedule after the success of Alexei Leonov's spacewalk. Soon, a stray glove drifted from the capsule. It would continue in orbit for another month before burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. The spacewalk was successful, except for a small break in communications.
The flight director says get back in.
This is Jim. What, got any message for us?
Gemini 4, get back in.
Okay. I don't know, we're coming over to the west there. They want you to come back in now.
Roger, we've been trying to talk to you for a while here.
Another first for Gemini 4 was that the control centre had moved from Cape Canaveral to a new home in Houston. And because the mission was due to last 4 days, it was the first time that 3 separate 8-hour shifts had gone into operation. There had been a problem with the computer, and the hatch had been difficult to open and close, but as Gemini 4 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, Mission Control regarded the flight as a success. But they now knew future missions would have to focus on orbital rendezvous.
You ain't gonna do much about it from here.
Post-flight honours for White and McDivitt included a ceremony at the University of Michigan, where they had both studied. At another ceremony, the President pinned NASA's Exceptional Service Medals on them. The Gemini program was just starting to deliver, but America was still not sure if they were catching up with the Soviet Union. Gemini was NASA's hastily conceived bridging program, designed to perfect techniques needed for a lunar landing. Gemini 4 saw astronaut Ed White leave his capsule and walk in space, but the spacecraft's attempt to rendezvous with its booster had been a failure. Gemini 5 had set an American endurance record of close to 8 days, but its rendezvous exercise had failed as well. On the morning of October the 25th, 1965, 2 rockets stood awaiting launch at Cape Canaveral. While astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford prepared for blastoff on Gemini 6, a special Atlas Agena target vehicle stood waiting on Pad 14. Because rendezvous and docking was integral to its moon landing strategy, NASA had commissioned the Agena docking module. It would be carried to orbit atop an Atlas booster. As the Gemini 6 crew were being strapped in, the Atlas-Agena combination was entering the final minutes of its countdown. The plan was for Gemini 6 to rendezvous and dock with the Agena 4 times in a flight that was expected to last 2 days. Gemini 6 was scheduled to launch around 90 minutes after the Agena, with the countdowns being tightly synchronized. The target vehicle lifted off as planned. This was the first Agena flight as part of the Gemini program, but the Atlas booster had served well during the Mercury program, and the Air Force had had success with the Agena upper stage, so no problems were expected. Gemini 6 waited as the target vehicle accelerated after a perfect launch. But minutes later, as the upper stage separated, all telemetry was lost, and tracking radar detected 5 separate pieces. The Gemini mission was now pointless, and the launch was cancelled with Schirra and Stafford leaving their spacecraft. There was debate about what to do next. Scheduling for the Gemini program had been tight, with roughly 1 new launch every 6 weeks. There was no replacement Agena ready to launch before the next flight, Gemini 7. On the morning of December the 4th, 1965, astronauts Jim Lovell and Frank Borman were breakfasting before the launch of their Gemini 7 spacecraft. Among the others dining with them were the Gemini 6 crew, who would launch 9 days later. Gemini 7 was to be the longest duration flight yet, and for comfort during almost 14 days in orbit, the crew were wearing new lightweight spacesuits. NASA's doctors were worried about the effect prolonged exposure to weightlessness would have on astronauts, particularly the observed loss of red blood cells.
3, 2, 1.
Gemini 7 was designed to answer medical questions. It launched on schedule, before Gemini 6, which had been renamed Gemini 6A.
We're on our way, Frank.
It had taken NASA more than 60 days to prepare for a new launch. Now crews had 8 days till the launch of Gemini 6A, and they swung into action immediately. As soon as they reached orbit, the Gemini 7 crew turned their craft and began tracking with its upper stage. Gemini 4 attempted this, but had failed due to an insufficient knowledge of orbital mechanics. On December the 12th, Schirra and Stafford again prepared for launch. If all went well, within 6 hours of blastoff, they would be orbiting alongside Gemini 7. The launch pad crew had done an excellent job readying the booster in record time, and the countdown continued smoothly.
2, 1. Ignition. Shut down, Gemini 6.
But then shut down. The engines had started, and after 1 second, they stopped.
Oxidizer pressure is down to about 32.
The commander Schirra had the option of pulling the D-ring and ejecting both of them from the capsule, but he sat tight.
Just sitting here breathing.
Nobody knew what had gone wrong. For a second time, the crew of Gemini 6 had failed to launch. A connector had come away before the booster had lifted off, and the onboard computer closed everything down. This was rectified, along with another glitch in a turbo pump. 3 days later, they were ready to try again.
Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The flight plan called for the rendezvous to happen on Gemini 6's 4th orbit, and Schirra made the first orbital correction 94 minutes into the flight. Gemini 7 would remain passive, with all orbital adjustments being made by Gemini 6. After 3 hours, slightly more than 400 kilometres separated the two craft, and Gemini 7 was picked up by Schirra and Stafford on radar. After 5 hours, Gemini 7 appeared as a bright dot, and soon after, the two spacecraft were flying in formation.
6 and 7 Hawaii will be standing by if you have anything for us.
Okay.
3 years earlier, in 1962, the Russians had launched Vostoks 3 and 4 so that they could pass close to each other, and it had seemed like another Soviet triumph. With the rendezvous of Gemini 6 and 7, the Americans realised that the Vostoks had accomplished 2 well-timed launches, a very different achievement to the precision on-orbit changes they had accomplished. For more than 4 hours, the two spacecraft flew side by side, sometimes coming as close as 30 centimetres. It gave NASA confidence in its rendezvous technique, but there had not been a docking as had originally been intended when the target had been the Agena. After slightly more than a day in orbit, Gemini 6 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and was picked up in the Atlantic Ocean. Gemini 7 continued on in orbit for 2 more record-breaking days, with Borman and Lovell reading books to pass the time. They returned to Earth on December the 18th and were picked up by the Wasp, the same ship that had recovered the Gemini 6 crew. It was at this point that NASA started to believe the American space program was gaining greater expertise than their Soviet adversaries. However, the elusive docking exercise had still not taken place, and nobody realised just how difficult this would be.
Gemini 7, are you able to see in the windows of 6 very easily and vice versa?
The combined Gemini 6 and 7 missions had flown in formation, but an original objective for 2 craft to join together in orbit, a process known as docking, could not be attempted because Gemini 6's Agena target vehicle had exploded just after launch.
We can very clearly see the horizon scanners operating.
All remaining Gemini missions would include rendezvous and docking, and Gemini 8, with first-time astronauts Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott, would be next. All NASA astronauts must be qualified pilots, and the space agency operates its own wing of T-38 jet trainers. To keep their flying hours up, astronauts often fly themselves between facilities across the United States in one of these 2-seaters. Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, the astronauts slated to fly Gemini 9, died in poor weather conditions when their T-38 crashed into a building at the McDonnell Aircraft Plant in St. Louis. They were going to inspect their spacecraft. Gemini 9 would become Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan's mission. Each flight had a backup crew that could take over at short notice. NASA was still in a hurry. On March the 16th, 1966, Gemini 8 waited on Launch Pad 19, while an Agena target vehicle waited on Pad 14. The Agena would launch 95 minutes before the Gemini craft, and the two would dock about 6 hours after launch. But docking was not the only aim of the Gemini 8 mission. Dave Scott was due to make America's second spacewalk. There had been setbacks in the Gemini program, and this flight was aimed at catching up. As Armstrong and Scott were being strapped into their craft, the Agena was in the final seconds of its countdown.
2, 1.
Mission controllers' faith in the Agena had been shaken after the previous vehicle had blown up at the ignition of the second stage. But soon after its launch, there was confirmation that this Agena would be waiting correctly in orbit when Gemini 8 arrived. The Agena was supposed to be controllable from the ground or from the spacecraft, but because there had been difficulty in receiving information from the target craft, Mission Control still had doubts about the Agena's attitude control system. Prior to docking, the crew were warned to turn the Agena's system off if it gave trouble. The docking manoeuvre went so smoothly that ground crew were at first uncertain that it had really happened. But soon there were problems as the linked craft began spinning and not responding to control. Immediately, Armstrong undocked, but the spin got worse with the astronauts in danger of passing out. They initiated an emergency return to Earth. Later analysis exonerated the Agena, revealing that one of the Gemini craft's thrusters had remained stuck on. The flight had lasted less than 11 hours. The two craft had only stayed docked for 30 minutes, and there had been no spacewalk. Yet mission planners noted the calm and professional way that Armstrong had handled what could have been a tragedy. Armstrong and Scott splashed down in the Pacific near Japan, the only Gemini craft not to land in the Atlantic. After the failure of the Atlas Agena target vehicle for the original Gemini 6 mission, its makers were relieved that it had performed well for the Gemini 8 mission. Some said difficulties had been due to the mix of different companies building the thing, with Convair making the Atlas first stage, Lockheed making the Upper Agena stage, and McDonnell responsible for the docking adapter. In May 1966, GATV-9 was prepared for launch. It would be Gemini 9's docking target. The first 2 minutes went perfectly, but after that, a short caused the right booster engine to gimbal hard over. The rocket flipped and headed back toward the ocean where it crashed. Convair accepted responsibility. As with Gemini 6, this left 2 astronauts sitting in a fully fueled Titan with nowhere to go. Tom Stafford, who'd been involved in 2 on-pad aborts with Gemini 6, and now this with Gemini 9, was nicknamed the Mayor of Pad 19. But this time a standby docking vehicle was available. The upper stage had no propulsion, but it did have a docking collar. It launched 2 weeks later. Gemini 9, now renamed Gemini 9A, was to follow shortly. But 3 minutes before the scheduled blastoff, ground computers lost contact with the Gemini computers. With only a 40-second window, the launch was scrubbed. Two days later, they tried again. This would be the 6th time Commander Stafford had been strapped in, with only one mission completed. Stafford and Cernan quickly caught up with their orbiting target, but something else had gone wrong.
Looks like an angry alligator out here rotating around.
The protective shroud had not come away. Inexperienced technicians had taped down the fiberglass lanyards, and they kept the two pieces together. Stafford dubbed it the angry alligator. Engineers on the ground desperately sought a solution, but there was just too much risk to the astronauts. There would be no docking on this mission. Next, Cernan left the capsule. He was to test a new manoeuvring unit, but his heart rate rose so alarmingly that the doctors ordered him back inside. He was overheating and his helmet had fogged. John Young would command the next mission, Gemini 10. His partner would be Michael Collins, making his first flight. He was also due to make the next spacewalk and was training in a cradle floating on air. This was to give him practice using the zip gun, but so far the spacewalks were presenting unexpected difficulties due to overexertion. This looked relaxing.
2, 1.
The Gemini flights were starting to conform to a pattern, with an Agena target vehicle launching 100 minutes before the manned spacecraft. This time there were no launch delays. The astronauts had a busy schedule, having to make up for the shortcomings of the two previous flights. The Agena was waiting for them exactly as intended. Rendezvous was now becoming routine. Young and Collins caught up with it, and after almost 6 hours they had docked. Gemini 10 used an 80-second burst from the Agena's engine to boost them to a higher orbit, where they visited an Agena from the Gemini 8 flight. Their rendezvous and docking exercises had gone well, but activity outside the spacecraft had still been difficult, with the inflated spacesuit limiting movement and important equipment being lost. On the following Gemini 11 flight, Richard Gordon also had great difficulty performing effectively outside the craft. NASA came up with a new training technique, one that they use to this day. Scuba diving had been seen as good training for fitness and regular breathing. Now they'd built a mock-up of the Gemini-Agena combination in a high school swimming pool in Baltimore. With just 60 days before Gemini 12, Buzz Aldrin began practicing his scheduled routine. In addition to his spacesuit, he carried 28 kilograms of lead to give him a neutral buoyancy. A clip-on tether was designed to solve the problem that previous astronauts had had just staying in one place. Detailed feedback from Aldrin helped engineers position handholds to make extravehicular activity, EVA, more precise. November the 11th, 1966, and the pad crew were all there for the final Gemini mission. Commander James Lovell and his pilot Buzz Aldrin arrived at their rocket with placards on their backs saying, "The End." Many of the team, wishing them farewell, had spent years on this project. There had been a suggestion that Gemini 12 should be delayed to coincide with the first launch in the Apollo series, but delays with the new spacecraft and its giant booster made this unfeasible. Rendezvous with the Agena was as expected, But on the ground, an anomaly in telemetry data suggested that the Agena's main engine could give problems, so they cancelled the boost to a higher orbit as had been intended.
Okay. That's only 12 CSQ.
Lovell docked the two craft. The next day, when Aldrin opened the hatch and moved outside, everything was different. The handrails made an immense difference. The gradual and deliberate way Aldrin moved gave no problems with exertion or overheating. He easily completed all his tasks, including attaching a tether between the Gemini and the Agena. When the spacecraft undocked, they remained connected. This is a technique NASA wanted to test, but it has not been used since. Project Gemini had ended on a high note. Jim Lovell had set a new record for the most hours in space, and his pilot, Buzz Aldrin, had more EVA hours than anyone else. The Gemini missions had achieved all they had set out to do. But ahead, there was an even bigger goal, and a much bigger rocket was being developed to make it happen. Nobody realised just how difficult the next stage would be. In the early 60s, during the Mercury program, the United States began developing a giant booster capable of carrying a crew of 3 to the moon. It used a cluster of tanks originally designed for other rockets, and the first flights just tested a mammoth lower stage. It became known as the Saturn I. Launches began in 1961, but although it could lift heavy loads, without upper stages it could not reach orbit. Engineers were expecting the usual teething problems with the big new rocket, but there were none. Every launch went as planned. At the same time, the new, much larger Apollo spacecraft was being developed. The initial Block 1 version was designed when NASA still envisioned the capsule with a large descent and return module would land directly on the moon. Several of these early models were built as test articles before NASA settled on a modified Block 2 design that included a docking probe and would work in conjunction with a lunar landing craft. Like previous American spacecraft, the Apollo capsule was designed to land in the ocean. Every situation was rigorously tested, and sometimes the value of these tests was glaringly obvious. The Apollo capsule was fitted with an escape tower, like its Mercury predecessor. In an emergency, sensors would trigger the solid fuel rockets, which would pull the craft away from an exploding booster. This was tested from a specially designed Little Joe rocket. During tests in 1965, the Little Joe was meant to test a high altitude abort, but just 26 seconds into the flight, the rocket developed a roll. It was a genuine emergency, and the system had worked perfectly. All across the US, different Apollo subsystems were being tested simultaneously. Though NASA now felt it had achieved parity with Russian technical ability, it was still in a race to the moon, still focused on President Kennedy's end of the decade deadline. It was a masterly feat of organisation. NASA enjoyed generous funding and popular support, with the United States going through a space-led technical revolution, and astronauts rivaling movie stars as figures of public adulation. By February 1966, a Saturn V was ready for an unmanned all-up test. This was a new technique for NASA. All-up testing meant testing a range of new systems in the one flight.
6, 5,
if all went well, it would save a lot of time.
Engine sequence start. 1, 0. Launch commit. We have a liftoff. All engines building up thrust. Moving out.
The Saturn I lower stage had been improved and was now known as the S-1B. This time there was a second stage, the S-4B. The combination would lift a Block 1 version of the Apollo spacecraft for its first flight. The capsule splashed down in the Atlantic 37 minutes after launch. The mission was generally a success, though there were engine difficulties, and wiring problems led to a loss of steering control and distortions in telemetry data. The focus now shifted to the first manned flight. Gus Grissom, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, and first-timer Roger Chaffee would crew an old-style Block 1 Apollo capsule in a mission scheduled for February 1967. Grissom had done valuable work in the development of the Gemini spacecraft, and he'd commanded the first Gemini mission. He'd taken on a similar role with the new Apollo command module, but he was becoming frustrated. He was concerned about the lag between changes made to the command module and the corresponding alterations to the simulators. The amount of flammable material that was in the crew compartment was also raised several times. While the booster technology was progressing steadily, the sheer complexity of the spacecraft was seeing it slip behind schedule. NASA was finding numerous deficiencies with the quality delivered by contractor North American Aviation. Another aspect of the astronauts' work involved an ever-expanding commitment to the mass media. Since its inception, NASA had decided that its activities would all be open to public scrutiny, in contrast to America's Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union, which chose to shroud its space program in secrecy. NASA's Public Affairs Office employed journalists who understood what working journalists needed, yet it was clear that the astronauts found photo calls a distraction. Regular press days were held in the lead-up to the mission. As the launch day approached, training in simulators shifted to testing of the spacecraft itself, sometimes in a vacuum chamber and sometimes as it sat atop its booster. One of these procedures, known as a plugs-out test, was to evaluate the Apollo capsule's function while it was disconnected from launch control, operating independently on its own power. There was no fuel in the spacecraft or in the booster, and all the pyros and explosive bolts were disabled, so this was regarded as a very safe situation. All other parameters would be the same as in a live countdown and launch. The astronauts would breathe pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure. This early version of the capsule had an old-style hatch that opened inwards. It would be held in place by the internal pressure. Later manned missions would have a different outward opening hatch. For hours the simulated countdown stopped and restarted, but at 6:30 a spark triggered a flash fire. In the pure oxygen environment, it consumed the capsule, killing the 3 astronauts in seconds. The United States was in mourning. Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee were buried with full military honours. Many at NASA had been dreading this kind of outcome. In a speech to colleagues at Mission Control, flight director Gene Kranz said, "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we locked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work." Manned flights were suspended. The space agency had to find out what went wrong and then completely redesign the capsule and mission procedures. All Apollo remnants were impounded, and NASA initiated an exhaustive investigation. Both houses of Congress also set up inquiries. Frank Borman was the only astronaut to serve on NASA's Accident Review Board. He was one of the few astronauts to serve as commander on his first mission, Gemini 7, and he'd been selected to command the third manned Apollo mission, but there was a cloud over the whole program. Ultimately, Borman's testimony before a House committee helped convince Congress that the manned Apollo program was safe to resume operations. Outside the inquiries, NASA tried to maintain its focus. Astronauts who were experts in every aspect of flight and related engineering were now being sent on field trips to learn about geology in preparation for moon missions. Although manned missions for 1967 had been put on hold, NASA still scheduled flights. The giant Saturn V booster, needed to get to the moon, was finally ready for launch. There had been delays with the second stage. Apollo 4 would be another all-up test, which included the problematic command module. On delivery from contractor North American Aviation, it was subjected to close scrutiny. More than 1,400 problems were discovered. The response of NASA managers, who were close to the Apollo 1 astronauts, ranged from fury to tears. Remedial work on the command module took 4 months, with Apollo 4 finally ready for launch in November 1967. The new rocket was covered in sensors, and cameras would record critical
Ignition
functions.
sequence starts. 5, 4, we have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
My God, our building's shaking here. Our building's shaking. The floor is terrific. The building's shaking. This big glass window is shaking. We're holding it with our hands. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet.
The cameras, intended to monitor the intricacies of staging, captured some of the most iconic images of the Apollo program. They were jettisoned soon after these pictures were captured and parachuted back for an ocean recovery. At this point, nobody knew whether President Kennedy's goal of a lunar landing by the end of the decade was achievable, and the Apollo 1 tragedy was making a lot of Americans have second thoughts about the race to the moon. At the beginning of 1968, NASA was preparing to launch the unmanned Apollo 5. A SaturnIb would lift a very different payload to low Earth orbit. It had been 12 months since 3 astronauts were incinerated, preparing for the Apollo 1 launch. Supporters of the American space program feared that inquiries in both houses of Congress, set up after the tragedy, would axe the Apollo program. But President Lyndon Johnson, who had decorated 2 of the Apollo 1 astronauts, had influence on Capitol Hill, and his ongoing support for NASA helped quell any political backlash. Work on a redesigned Apollo capsule was progressing. But the rush to meet President Kennedy's end-of-the-decade deadline sat uncomfortably with the need for precision and quality. All flammable materials had been eliminated from the spacecraft and spacesuits. At launch, the astronauts would no longer breathe pure oxygen, and the complex hatch had been replaced by a one-piece unit that could be opened rapidly. More than 1,400 wiring problems had been corrected. But there was one vital piece of the Apollo program that remained untested. Nothing like it had ever flown. The lunar landing craft, known as the Lunar Module, had been plagued with development problems, and its first test flight had been delayed by almost 12 months. It consisted of a descent stage that would remain on the Moon and an ascent stage that would return the astronauts to the Apollo Command Module, waiting in lunar orbit. Each part had its own engine. In testing, the descent engine had not been burning smoothly. Of all the Apollo hardware, this engine had to respond to the most delicate control. Rigorous testing finally solved this problem, and LM-1 was prepared for flight. The unmanned Apollo 5 would test the craft in Earth orbit. The lunar module, packed beneath the unique nose cone, had no landing legs, as these would have further delayed delivery. And after pressure tests on LM-5 had blown out a window, LM-1 had aluminium panels instead of glass in its windows.
RTC, will you site select? Guido.
On January the 22nd, 1968, the two-stage Saturn 1B stood fueled and waiting on Cape Canaveral pad 37B.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, ignition detected.
Transmitted 5 enter.
Clock start. 5 enter.
Thrust okay.
Affirmative. Program 11.
Okay, TLK P11.
Roll pitch start.
Roll in pitch.
This mission would be judged entirely on telemetry, on the electronic flow from sensors monitoring every system in the booster and the lunar module. At the end of the flight, nothing would return to Earth.
Cutoff plus 50.
NASA needed to know how the lunar module's descent and ascent engines would function in space. A software problem shut down a descent engine burn after only 4 seconds, but Mission Control were able to reprogram it. After 11 hours, all systems had been checked, and the mission declared a success. Astronauts would only have one opportunity to fly the craft, and 2 different types of simulator were developed for training. The Lunar Landing Research Facility at Langley exposed astronauts to the kind of decisions they would have to make during the last 50 meters of their descent to the lunar surface. But this was a bit like a carnival ride, and the astronauts preferred the free-flying simulator known as the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, or LLRV. It was nicknamed the Flying Bedstead. A gimbal jet engine provided partial lift that helped the craft behave as though it was under the influence of lunar gravity. The rest of the lift and the control came from throttleable rockets, similar to those in the lunar module. Just like any other aircraft, it had to be thoroughly tested, and NASA test pilot Joe Walker made the first series of flights in 1964. It could take off and fly using the jet engine and then be switched to sim mode when it would behave like the lunar module. In 1967, Neil Armstrong was the first astronaut to fly the prototype. The following year he flew a modified version with cockpit walls that limited his view to something like he'd see through the lunar module window. When switched into sim mode, the response to pilot control became sluggish, as close as experts could make it to the way the lunar module would behave in lunar gravity. Later, astronauts would call the LLRV the unsung hero of the Apollo program, but NASA administrators were having second thoughts. It would not be the last crash. Of 5 LLRVs and its derivatives, only one was left at the end of the Apollo program. The second Saturn V launch was the final unmanned Apollo mission, Apollo 6. Mission objectives included monitoring the amount of vibration a fully loaded Saturn V would experience. It was carrying a dummy lunar module and a hybrid command and service module. Like Apollo 4, it was not just covered with sensors, but cameras too. Being the first time the Saturn V was carried, 2 minutes into the flight, vibrations ran through the length of the rocket, causing damage to the adapter housing the lunar module. When the second stage took over, 2 of its engines cut out early, affecting the final orbit. The third stage had to burn longer to compensate. Inside the command module, a camera was trained on the window and at various parts of the astronaut's instrument panel. After 3 orbits, the upper stage failed to reignite as commanded. NASA wanted to test the capsule in a high-altitude, high-speed re-entry, so the command and service module separated from the upper stage and used its own engine to boost it to a higher orbit for a faster re-entry. Though Apollo 6 was troubled with technical difficulties, NASA understood the vibration problems well and was able to redesign various subsystems according to the information gathered during this mission. Finally, NASA was ready to launch another manned mission, and by October 1968, Apollo 7 stood ready for launch. It had a completely redesigned command module, and the astronauts would wear a completely new spacesuit. After the Apollo 1 fire, the new A7L suit was fire-resistant with an outer layer of Teflon-coated beta fabric. A one-piece fishbowl helmet that did away with the need for a visor and a visor seal was fitted to the shoulders, allowing head movement and providing superior visibility. On the morning of October the 11th, 1968, 3 astronauts were prepared for the Apollo program's first manned flight. It would be the program's last Saturn 1B mission and would not carry a lunar module. Veteran of the Mercury and Gemini programs Wally Schirra and 2 first-time astronauts, Don Isley and Walter Cunningham, would be NASA's first astronauts to fly in almost 2 years.
4, 3, 2, we have ignition. Commit liftoff. We have liftoff. This is launch control. We have cleared the tower.
Roger, tower clear. 12 seconds out and the roll program has commenced.
The bigger Apollo capsule provided a more comfortable environment necessary for long-duration flights that were required to get to the moon. The crew could take off or put on their bulky spacesuits as required, and they didn't have to remain in their couches, as in the Mercury and Gemini spacecraft. Soon after reaching orbit, the command and service module separated from the S-4B upper stage. On a moon mission, this would normally house the lunar module. One of the 4 adapter panels had not opened fully. On subsequent flights, these would separate completely from the upper stage. The spacecraft turned around and practiced docking using a visual reference target that would usually be mounted on the lunar module. Not long into the mission, Schirra came down with a cold, and in the confines of the capsule, it quickly spread to the other 2. In zero gravity, the nasal congestion was not clearing in the same way it would on Earth, and the crew were very uncomfortable. Eating became a sore point with the astronauts. Though the food had improved since the earlier space missions, the freeze-dried and bite-sized rehydratable meals fell short of what they considered acceptable. The demands on this mission were considerable. Tense interchanges between the sick astronauts and mission control were not uncommon. They had to fire the service module engine no less than 8 times. Public relations reached new heights on the mission. A series of TV broadcasts from the capsule were watched around the world. At one point, Schirra refused to switch on the TV equipment because the schedule was too crowded and the crew had not eaten. Preparing for re-entry, a new dispute broke out. The astronauts refused to wear their helmets during the return to Earth. With their colds, they worried about the rapid changes in pressure. They wanted to hold their noses and blow to equalize the pressure. Aboard the carrier Essex, the Apollo 7 astronauts were treated as returning heroes, but they did not receive the usual NASA honours, and Schirra, Isley and Cunningham never flew again. In October 1968, a Saturn V began inching its way to Cape Kennedy's Launch Complex 39, Pad A. There had been 2 previous Saturn V launches, but this one, Apollo 8, would be the first to carry a crew. Originally intended as a manned test of the lunar module in Earth orbit, flight objectives were radically readjusted when a lunar module could not be ready in time. The flight crew was changed too. Jim Lovell was the command module pilot. And though there was no lunar module, Bill Anders was the designated lunar module pilot. Frank Borman would command the revamped mission. The original Apollo 8 astronauts were moved to Apollo 9. They would be the first men to leave Earth orbit and fly around the moon, and these astronauts had had very little time to retrain for this new mission.
15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the tower.
On the previous Saturn V, harmonic vibration had caused the early shutdown of 2 engines. Action taken to rectify the problem saw a flawless launch for Apollo 8. 11.5 minutes after launch, the spacecraft, still attached to the upper stage, achieved orbit, with both the ground staff and space crew entering an intense period of system checking. This was a risky mission. A less public reason it had been brought forward came from the CIA. Intelligence suggested that Russia was preparing a lunar orbital mission.
Apollo 8, Houston. Go ahead, Houston. Apollo 8, you are go for TLI. Over. Roger, understand. We're go for TLI.
TLI, Trans-Lunar Injection. Soon after, the S-4B upper stage fired, pushing Apollo 8 out of Earth orbit toward the Moon. Now, a new problem arose. Frank Borman began to feel sick and threw up, which was even more unpleasant in zero gravity. Because of the attitude of the spacecraft, they could not see the Moon, but through the round window they began seeing more and more of the Earth. Soon they would be the first people to see our planet in its entirety. However, this window soon fogged with gas from the oils in the chemical sealant. Apollo 7 had also suffered from this problem. As Apollo 8 approached the Moon, the crew prepared for an engine burn that would place the craft in lunar orbit. The main engine had to fire for 4 minutes when the command module was behind the Moon, out of radio contact. This was the first time that the crew got a decent view of the Moon. William Anders prepared to photograph the lunar surface. An important part of the mission was to document areas such as the Sea of Tranquility in preparation for future lunar landings. Then on the 4th orbit, they saw something astounding.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?
After this mission, it was often said that they went to the Moon and discovered the Earth.
You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick.
After 10 orbits of the Moon, Apollo 8 fired its main engine and began its return to Earth.
Just grab me a color. Color exterior. There.
During its cruise back, Bill Anders captured more pictures of the Earth. The Apollo 8 astronauts returned as heroes. Their flight around the Moon had put NASA's space effort back on the front pages. But it was the end of 1968, and there was only 1 year left to reach the Moon within President Kennedy's deadline. Just 2 months later, Russell Schweickart, Dave Scott, and Commander Jim McDivitt were preparing for the next Apollo mission. Apollo 9 would be the first test of the complete Apollo system. Till now, the lunar module had made only one flight when it was tested without a crew. This would be the first time 2 spacecraft had been launched together. And, like all Apollo missions, it would be far more complex than the mission that had preceded it. A February launch had been delayed to March the 3rd, 1969, to allow the crew to recover from a virus they had contracted. Though Apollo 9 would remain in Earth orbit, the crew faced a punishing schedule. Not only would they be the first to fly the lunar module, but a spacewalk had been planned to test the new self-contained life support system. After reaching orbit, the command and service modules separated from the S-4B upper stage that carried the lunar module. They docked with the lunar lander to withdraw it from the S-4B. After separation, Apollo 9 backed away to a safe distance, and ground control sent the discarded stage on a course towards the Sun. The next few days were spent in maneuvers, with the main engine being fired 5 times, changing the orbit in preparation for testing of the lunar module and to simulate mid-course corrections that would be needed on a trip to the Moon. The crew had removed the hatches and probes to clear the connecting tunnel between the command module and the lunar module that had been named Gumdrop and Spider. These were the first NASA craft to be named since Gemini 3's Molly Brown. Every aspect of the linked spacecraft was closely monitored in mission control. Soon, McDivitt and Schweikart would fly in a machine that had no capability of returning to the ground, and nothing could go wrong. In case something did go wrong and the two craft could not dock again, a spacewalk had been planned to test an outside transfer between Spider and Gumdrop. This was the Apollo program's first spacewalk, and Rusty Schweikart was only connected by a nylon tether. All his oxygen and electrical power came from the portable life support system he wore on his back.
Okay, Dave, come on out.
Both spacecraft had been depressurized, and while Schweikart was busy at the lunar module, Dave Scott was retrieving an experimental sample from the outside of the command module. This spacewalk was cut short because Schweikart was suffering from space sickness.
Okay, we're nice and stable with respect to you.
The next day, Spider and Gumdrop separated for the first time.
It's a nice looking machine. So is yours.
Using its descent engine, Spider, the lunar module, withdrew to a distance of around 150 kilometers. The next time Dave Scott in the command module saw the lunar module, it had jettisoned its lower descent stage. All engine tests for both stages had worked well, and NASA was developing confidence in their new moon craft. Before redocking with the command module, McDivitt and Schweikart did a complex series of pirouettes to allow Scott to inspect Spider from every angle. When the three astronauts were reunited, the lunar module was jettisoned, eventually to burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. They spent several more days in orbit photographing the Earth before splashing down in the Atlantic. NASA had just 9 more months to meet President Kennedy's end-of-the-decade deadline for putting a man on the moon, but there was one more step before they made the first attempt to land.
All stages pressurized.
Apollo 10 would take a lunar module to the moon and descend toward the lunar surface, but it would not land. In keeping with NASA's very tight schedule, it had a long list of questions to answer, and the mission would have the most experienced crew of any Apollo mission so far. Lunar module pilot Gene Cernan had flown on Gemini 9. Command module pilot John Young had flown on Gemini 3 and 10. And Commander Tom Stafford had flown on Gemini 6 and 9. One of the important problems that this mission had to solve was linked with the moon's uneven gravitation. Previous manned and unmanned lunar orbital missions had discovered that variable concentrations of mass within the moon had caused lunar orbits to be erratic. NASA needed to map these irregularities to fully understand how their spacecraft would perform in lunar orbit.
9. We have ignition sequence start. Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2. All engines running. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff 49 minutes past the hour.
Apollo 10 would be a complete rehearsal for the first lunar landing. It would be the second Apollo craft to leave Earth orbit. Docking with and extraction of the lunar module, which had been the major focus of previous missions, was becoming commonplace.
Okay, it's looking real stable to us. We show you closing finally. Roger. Ground snap, and we're there. Got 2 grays. Roger.
Apollo 10 was the first spacecraft to make colour television transmissions, and they pulled in audiences of around 1 billion.
Do whatever he says.
As in the previous mission, Apollo 10 had 2 spacecraft each needing a different call sign. The astronauts had elected to call the mothership Charlie Brown and the lunar module Snoopy after the popular Peanuts cartoon strip of the time. After this, the space crews were asked to choose names that had a little more gravitas. When they disappeared behind the moon, they fired the main engine for 6 minutes, which the astronauts described as being interminable. The craft went into lunar orbit as planned, and 6 hours later, Stafford and Cernan entered Snoopy to prepare it for descent toward the lunar surface. It was teeming with weightless flakes of mylar insulation that had come loose when the connecting tunnel had pressurized. This caused itching for the rest of the flight. But there were more problems.
Charlie Brown, Houston, we're concerned about this yaw bias in the limb and apparent slippage of the docking ring. We'd like you to disable...
The lunar module was more than 3 degrees out of alignment with the command module, and air pressure in the tunnel between the 2 craft could not be released. Houston was worried that undocking now could damage the latches that held them together. Engineers on the ground decided that anything less than 6 degrees was not a problem, and Snoopy was given the all clear to undock. This was the first time a lunar module had flown in the lunar environment for which it had been designed. Mission planners were concerned that Stafford and Cernan might try to seize the opportunity to make an unauthorized landing, so Snoopy had been short-fueled. If they did land, they could not get back. For the next 8 hours, John Young would be alone in Charlie Brown.
Houston, Charlie Brown, how do you read on high gate, over? Charlie Brown, Houston, over. Roger, read your last clear. Snoopy was go for DOI. Roger, great, sounds great, we copy.
Snoopy dropped lower and lower, passing directly over the proposed landing site for the next Apollo mission and travelling more than 500 kilometres from the mothership. But just before they were due to jettison the descent stage, a guidance setting switch was in the wrong mode, and the lunar module began gyrating wildly. By dumping the descent stage and switching to manual control, Tom Stafford was able to regain stability.
Charlie, how was the stage? Good, huh? Wait till that thing blinks. Charlie Brown, Houston, they got staging. They had a wild gyration, though, but they got it under control, over.
The rendezvous went according to plan, and Apollo 10 remained in lunar orbit for another 29 hours, mapping anomalies in the lunar gravity before returning to the Earth. But even as they were near the moon, another Saturn V had been rolled out to the launch pad. Apollo 11 was being prepared for the first attempt at a landing on the moon. Early on July the 16th, 1969, vast numbers were gathering along the beaches of central Florida to witness history. The American people had been preparing for this moment for almost a decade since the late President Kennedy had responded to the Soviet Union's early superiority in space technology by setting a trip to the moon as a national goal. More than 1 million people were crowding the roads and causeways around Cape Canaveral that had recently been renamed Cape Kennedy. Minor dignitaries and friends and families of space workers had access to special stands constructed in the grounds of the Kennedy Space Center to see the Apollo 11 astronauts blast off. While the public had great faith in NASA's ability to land men on the moon, the experts working in the space business put their chances of success at no better than 50-50. The astronauts had spent long hours in simulators preparing for every eventuality, yet the equipment they used for practice only provided an approximation of conditions in space, with some of the test rigs appearing bizarre. A special gantry built at NASA Langley provided something approaching the experience of lunar gravity. Hours before the scheduled launch, the giant Saturn V was slowly taking fuel. Its tanks would be constantly topped up till seconds before liftoff. Michael Collins was the command module pilot. He'd flown previously on Gemini 10. Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. He'd pioneered new techniques for spacewalking on Gemini 12. And the mission commander was Neil Armstrong. On Gemini 8, his cool head and quick thinking had saved the mission from tragedy. Apollo 11 would have a fully experienced team chosen to deal with and solve difficult problems. And there would be problems. Every NASA mission had built on the experience of previous missions, but there was always a point when they entered unknown territory, and the pressure to reach the moon before the end of 1969 had been unrelenting.
We're going to the moon together.
But American people were supremely confident, and launch parties were held across the country. Local entrepreneurs were quick to capitalise on the mood of celebration.
The swing arm now coming back as our countdown continues.
At the Kennedy Launch Center, tension was high. The German-born rocket pioneer, Wernher von Braun, his whole life had been leading up to this moment.
Below we have a team of technicians working.
Everyone at the Cape understood how many different components had to work correctly for a successful launch. Astronauts agreed that the launch made them most anxious.
Firing command coming in now.
This would be the 6th launch of the Saturn V booster, and while some of these flights had been a little lumpy, all were regarded as successful.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6.
Just seconds into the flight, control was transferred from the firing room in the launch complex to mission control in Houston.
Apollo 11, this is Houston, radio check over.
12 minutes after launch, Apollo 11 was in low Earth orbit. Apart from a slightly rough ride with the third stage, everything had been routine.
5x2, very weak. Can you give us a status report, please?
Trans-lunar injection and docking with the lunar module were now practices that had been done many times before, and they too were achieved with little fuss.
Oh, well, it's clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are dark.
The cruise to the moon and lunar orbit had been done twice before, and flight manuals and checklists had all been rewritten with the benefit of previous experience. The Apollo system had been designed so that all the navigation information and engine burns could be made autonomously by the crew, but radio ranging techniques had improved so rapidly that mission control was now giving all instructions. However, the crew still used the onboard technology to determine their position in case of a communications problem. Command module pilots took pride in the accuracy of their navigation. Both the command and lunar modules were equipped with the Apollo guidance computer, one of the first practical microcomputers.
We recommend you accept the nav 49, continue through your sequence of sightings, and then we'll...
For most computations, there was a manual workaround, but for the complex flight path required for the lunar module to land on the moon, the flight computer was essential.
Trunnion angle 47, something to be a little high. Stand by.
Now in lunar orbit, the crew of Apollo 11 would lose radio contact every time they passed behind the moon.
44 over. Yeah, roger.
During the 13th orbit, the lunar module separated from the command module.
How does it look? The eagle has wings. Right.
The two craft now adopted individual call signs. The command module became Columbia, and the lunar module was now Eagle. Descent to the moon happened in 3 separate stages, each controlled by its own computer program.
Roger, let us know when you're ready to copy. We have a DOI pad.
The first stage was the braking phase that changed the orbit so it would reach a zone above the designated landing point. During this period, the crew were travelling feet first, looking up at the Earth. The next stage was the approach phase, when the Eagle tipped up into a more vertical attitude. This was when Aldrin and Armstrong got their first view of the landing point. A long elliptical region in the Sea of Tranquility was their target. The open plain was judged to be the easiest place for the first lunar landing.
Altitude lights out.
Now, unexpected things began happening. Fuel in the lunar lander's tanks began sloshing around. While this was not dangerous, the motion meant the craft could give no clear indication about its pre-programmed landing site.
Program alarm. 1202. 1202. Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
Then the flight computer began sounding an alarm, and there was only one person in mission control that knew what a 1202 alarm was. A young software engineer understood the computer was overloaded, but that it could still look after critical functions.
Roger, Delta H is looking good to us.
The mission would continue.
Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
The final part of the landing sequence was still computer controlled, but it allowed the commander to override the craft's rate of descent and its positioning. As it was heading for a field of large boulders, Armstrong took control, looking for an appropriate landing area.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward.
This took a lot longer than anyone expected.
185. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. 6 forward.
Fuel was running low.
60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. 20. Down 1/2. 30 seconds. Forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
The relief in mission control was palpable.
We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Because of the distractions during the descent, no one had a clear idea of the Eagle's exact location.
Master arm on. Take care of the descent.
After the craft was made secure, the flight plan called for the astronauts to get some sleep. But Armstrong and Aldrin requested a change, which was agreed to. They began preparing for their walk on the lunar surface. Around 7 hours later, Armstrong was climbing down the ladder.
Depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches.
A black and white TV camera was now activated, and around the world, 600 million people were watching.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was something new. No one had thought that history would be televised with the world as witness. It had even been argued that television was a waste of time. Now NASA was rescheduling future missions so their astronauts would step onto the moon in prime time. Armstrong and Aldrin spent 2.5 hours on the lunar surface, and much of that time was used in ceremonial duties such as planting the US flag and chatting to the president. The trip back to lunar orbit went smoothly. From here, the 3 astronauts were back on thoroughly understood ground. The 3-day return cruise to Earth was a calm period before a storm of publicity obligations that the Apollo 11 astronauts had not prepared for. Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins were feted in ticker-tape parades across the United States and then across the world. The generous taxpayer funding that had kept the space program going was now in doubt, and NASA was keen to build on this wave of popularity. But in the corridors of power, questions were being asked about the vast sums required to put men on the moon. Toward the end of the 1960s, America finally had something to celebrate. Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins had returned safely from the moon. For America, the decade had started with an uncomfortable realization. Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union, had a commanding lead in space technology. The United States had been seized by a wave of anti-communist paranoia. 9 years and $17 billion later, Apollo 11 had planted the US flag on the surface of the moon.
First set foot upon the moon. July 1969. It came in peace for all mankind.
Around the planet, 600 million people had watched on TV. The world's population was watching history, and they knew it.
Tranquility Base, this is Houston. Can we get both of you on the camera for a minute, please?
At beaches and rivers in central Florida, 1 million Americans had turned out to see the launch of Apollo 11. November the 14th, 1969, was a wet day at the Kennedy Launch Center. Numbers that turned out to watch the launch of Apollo 12 had dropped by 2/3. After the huge viewing numbers attracted by Apollo 11, NASA upgraded all aspects of the television coverage for the remaining moon landings. Pete Conrad would command the mission with rookie Alan Bean and command module pilot Dick Gordon. Their destination, the Ocean of Storms, just near the landing site of Surveyor 3, the unmanned craft that had touched down 2 years earlier.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff. 11:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
The driving rain was not seen as a problem. Although high winds could delay a launch, the Saturn V was an all-weather vehicle, and the wet conditions were not a factor.
Roger, clear the tower. I got a pitch and a roll program, and this baby is really going. Roger, Pete.
Soon after liftoff, lightning struck Apollo 12 and ran down the ionized exhaust trail to the launch tower.
We had everything in the world drop out. Roger.
All instrumentation in the command module went haywire, and telemetry readouts on the ground were showing garbage.
Apollo 12 Houston, try FCE to auxiliary, over.
For a short while, nobody in the craft or on the ground knew what had gone wrong.
FCE to auxiliary.
Finally, the crew was asked to flip an obscure reset switch. Only Alan Bean knew where it was. It restored all instrumentation, and the mission could continue.
Apollo 12 Houston, go for staging. Some really big pitch, gang. Got a good S2, gang. Roger, we copy, Pete. You're looking good. Right, Pete, your fuel cells look good down here.
After the huge television audiences for the Apollo 11 lunar mission, NASA had equipped Apollo 12 with a colour camera so that audiences around the world could see higher quality pictures from the surface of the moon. The second landing on the moon benefited greatly from design changes derived from the Apollo 11 experience. Baffles inside the lunar module's fuel tanks prevented unwanted sloshing that had confused the flight computer.
Yeah. 81, 32, 32. Coming down.
The landing went exactly as planned, with the astronauts recognizing all the landmarks in the vicinity of the Surveyor 3 probe.
He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light. Roger, copy contact. TV starting to...
But as Pete Conrad climbed toward the lunar surface, in the United States, it was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and very few people were watching the live television pictures.
I bet you when I get down to the bottom of the ladder, I can see the surveyor.
Viewer ratings were important for NASA. They knew keeping the American taxpayer on side was an important part of convincing politicians that the space agency's generous funding should be maintained.
I'm going to step off the pad, Mark.
As Alan Bean joined Conrad on the lunar surface, he grabbed the TV camera to relocate it and inadvertently pointed it at the sun.
Yeah, pull the hatch closed here. Okay. Don't lock it.
They were the last live Apollo 12 TV pictures from the moon. The pinpoint landing, the much longer stay on the moon, and the larger volume of return samples all made Apollo 12 a technical success. But NASA had wanted to keep the American public engaged with the space program, and the only pictures anyone saw were short film grabs. Americans were losing interest in space. After the return of Apollo 12, there were still 8 more Saturn V launch vehicles in production, enough to stretch as far as Apollo 20. But in January 1970, Apollo 20 was cancelled, and soon the planned Apollo 18 and 19 missions were also scrapped. As NASA was preparing to reap the benefits of space engineering and lunar research, the program was being curtailed. Things would change slightly for Apollo 13. NASA rescheduled the mission's lunar activity to coincide with prime viewing time across the United States. This would cost TV networks money, and they were not happy. Commander Jim Lovell had flown around the moon as command module pilot on Apollo 8. This would be his 4th spaceflight. His colleagues were both first-time astronauts. The lunar module pilot was Fred Haise, but the 3rd member of the team had come from the backup crew just 3 days before launch. Command module pilot Jack Swigert replaced the original crew member Ken Mattingly, who had been exposed to German measles. Mattingly watched the launch from Mission Control in Houston.
9, 8, ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13.
Its objective on the moon was the Fra Mauro Highlands, named after the adjacent Fra Mauro crater.
And it has cleared the tower.
During powered flight, a 2nd stage engine cut out early. The remaining units burned for slightly longer to compensate, but this was no major problem.
Not right now, flight. All the other engines are go. Okay, Joe, I'm pointing over toward Jack, and it's pretty...
Translunar injection happened smoothly, and the crew soon pulled out their colour TV camera to entertain the people back on Earth. But apart from the people in Mission Control, no one was watching. The TV networks failed to broadcast the transmissions sent from Apollo 13.
Dane, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
Soon after they had ceased their transmission, with the spacecraft 3/4 of the way to the moon, an explosion took out the command module's main power supply.
Can say again, please?
Houston, we've had a problem.
Nobody understood what had happened, but it soon became obvious that Apollo 13 would not land on the moon.
Stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
Jack, Aquarius,
With the command module effectively dead, the lunar lander now became the astronaut's sole source of power. Its descent engine would be used for all course corrections. The spacecraft continued out and around the moon on a free return trajectory.
No, that's an Atlantic landing site.
A landing in the South Atlantic would get them back quickest, but there were no recovery ships in that area. Before Apollo 13 disappeared behind the moon, ground staff began recalculating the burn that would return the craft to the Pacific Ocean. While there was enough food and oxygen to last till the return to Earth, water and power would be critical. Before long, temperatures in the craft had dropped to near freezing. With strictly rationed water, Fred Haise got a urinary tract infection. The plan was to restore power to the command module using the re-entry batteries just before they hit the Earth's atmosphere. This had never been done before, so a team of experts, including Ken Mattingly, began experimenting with different procedures in a simulator. NASA's space program was back in the headlines, but not for the reasons they wanted. Simulations of the power-up sequence were complicated because condensation, caused by the low temperatures in the command module, threatened to short out the electrical system. But finally a procedure was radioed to the crew. The rescue showed NASA at its best, creatively solving difficult problems as they arose and returning the 3 astronauts safely. Apollo 13 would become known as a successful failure.
Roger, sufficient. Thank you. Cameras and
Alan Shepard was NASA's first man in space. Though his Mercury capsule, Freedom 7, had only flown for 15 minutes, he was destined to become an important part of America's space program. In 1964, he was diagnosed with Meniere's disease and suspended from all flight activities. He spent the Gemini program as chief of the astronaut office. After corrective surgery, he was restored to flight duty and eventually was made commander of Apollo 14. His command module pilot was Stuart Roosa, and the lunar module pilot was Ed Mitchell. Apollo 14's objective was Fra Mauro, the same area in the lunar highlands that had been targeted by the aborted Apollo 13. It would be the last of the H-type missions that carried no vehicle.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at Apollo 14. 3 minutes past the hour.
Finally, after almost 10 years, Alan Shepard was back in space. Not long after Apollo 14 reached orbit, his space flight time had doubled. Like all previous Apollo missions, it would be more complex than the one that preceded it. And like all Apollo missions, there would be problems. Docking with the lunar module should have been routine, but on this occasion, the mechanism would not lock. After 5 attempts, there was still no success.
Okay, Houston, we've hit it twice.
On the 6th attempt, Stu Roosa made a more aggressive use of his thrusters, and the 2 craft locked together.
We got some, Houston. I believe I got a hard dock, Houston. Okay, we seem real steady. I'm going to...
In lunar orbit, after the lunar module Antares had separated from the mothership Kitty Hawk, the landing computer began flashing an alarm. The abort switch had an intermittent short that would trigger an automatic abort sequence if it happened during the powered stage of Antares' descent to the surface. At Mission Control, though they couldn't fix the switch, they decided to reprogram the computer so it would ignore the spurious alert. They had 2 hours to work out the new code. It fell to MIT programmer Don Iles, who came up with a workaround. The new sequence was tested in a simulator, and then the 61 keystrokes required were read up to the astronauts. The landing proceeded with pinpoint accuracy.
2 feet per second, look at 3, 20 feet, 10, 3 feet per second, contact now, 2, stop, 3, whoa, okay, we made it to landing.
The lunar module had landed on a 7-degree incline that made moving in the cabin difficult. They were about 1 kilometre from the rim of Cone Crater, where they were scheduled to collect samples during their second moonwalk. As with every successful Apollo moon landing mission, the astronauts unfurled the American flag. Before Apollo 11, it had been proposed that the United Nations flag be planted, but Congress had passed a law stating that no flag other than the Stars and Stripes could be deployed. During previous lunar missions, astronauts had spoken about how difficult it was to judge distances and to recognise landmarks. Shepard and Mitchell were tiring during their climb toward the rim of Cone Crater. Doctors at Mission Control monitoring their heart rates became concerned. They were ordered to return without realising they were only 20 metres from their objective. But NASA was about to eliminate this problem. Apollo astronauts were training with a new piece of hardware. All remaining missions would be able to travel 10 times further from the lunar module using the new lunar rover. Geology was the main feature of the remaining Apollo missions. Preliminary analysis was showing that the moon had once been molten with rocks containing no trace of water. Dave Scott would command Apollo 15. Jim Irwin was the lunar module pilot. This would be his first spaceflight. Al Worden was the command module pilot. Apollo 15 was also his first spaceflight. Refinements in the design of the Saturn V launch vehicle and improvements in the targeting and trajectory parameters meant that a heavier version of the lunar module could now reach the moon, carrying heavier loads.
Liftoff. We have liftoff at 9:34 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
The new expanded missions were called J missions. Not only could they take more to the moon, they could bring a greater mass of lunar rock back to the Earth. Their target on the lunar surface was Hadley Rill, a peculiar winding groove, probably formed by ancient volcanic activity. The landing site was in the lunar northern hemisphere near the Apennine Mountains. Separation of the lunar module Falcon from the command module was delayed by a hatch problem, but this was soon solved. Landing techniques were now so refined that Scott was easily able to compensate for an early 6-kilometre aberration and set Falcon down for another pinpoint landing.
Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley.
The quality of television pictures from the moon had continued to improve as audiences across the United States dwindled. The big difference was the rover. Not only would it allow the astronauts to travel further and to carry more samples, but without exerting themselves. Scott and Irwin used less oxygen and could stay longer on the surface. Dave Scott had taken his geology training very seriously, and on the crew's second traverse in the lunar rover, this training paid off.
Okay, that's as good a way as any.
They discovered a white rock at the bottom of the Hadley Rill, which was thought to be part of the lunar bedrock. It became known as the Genesis Rock, and it was more than 4 billion years old. After almost 3 days on the moon, Scott and Irwin prepared the Falcon for return to lunar orbit.
Good liftoff, automatic.
There had only been a few minor glitches during the earlier parts of the mission, and rendezvous, docking and the cruise back to Earth continued to remain problem-free. During the final descent, the remaining highly corrosive fuel from the capsule's thrusters was dumped, but this time it caused the collapse of one of the craft's 3 parachutes. Further damage would have been catastrophic. As 1972 commenced, there were only 2 remaining Apollo missions. Though the lunar expeditions were increasing in duration and complexity, the American people had lost interest, and so had the political administration. Life-threatening difficulties occurred on every flight. But NASA had been so good at overcoming problems that the drama of lunar exploration was easily pushed off the front pages by war and political scandal. When the last ever mission to the moon blasted off at night during prime time, TV networks were annoyed that launch delays messed up their viewing schedule. Astronaut Gene Cernan would be the last man to walk on the moon, and with the return of Apollo 17 to the Earth, lunar exploration stopped. There are no plans to return to the moon.